Welcome to the NMI podcast, and we're really privileged today to be speaking to Dr. Thomas Guilliams, and we'll call him Tom for short. I want to give you a bit of a brief introduction into his background and work before we dive into the theme and the topic, which I'll share with you in a moment. But he earned his doctorate in molecular immunology from the Medical College of Wisconsin, and he's for the past 28 years or so has been involved and spent time investigating the mechanisms of action of lifestyle and nutrient-based therapies. He's an expert in the science and therapeutic use of dietary supplements, and that's what we're going to largely dive into in this conversation. He's an adjunct associate professor at the University of Wisconsin School of Pharmacy and was VP of Science for Ortho Molecular Products for 24 years. He still serves as a consultant there over the past decade, and this is where Tom really came to my awareness is through his writing and teaching manuals, which he calls roadmaps. So he's been writing and producing these, and they teach and evaluate the principles and protocols that are fundamentals to the functional and integrative medicine communities. So there are a number of different monographs and books that I'd implore you to look up. We'll mention it again and we'll link back to the Point Institute, but the Point Institute is he's director and founder, and that's where these publications live. But we'll link to the Point Institute. These publications include, just as some examples, the role of stress in the HPA Axis in chronic disease management, which is now in its second edition. As well as, and we're going to talk about this, supplementing dietary nutrients, also in its second edition, with a great foreword, I might add, by Dr. Jeff Bland. It's, really speaks to the importance of this as a fundamental textbook in the field. And as founder of and director of the Point Institute, he is an independent researcher, and the Institute is a publishing organization that facilitates the distribution of these publications. He's a world-renowned speaker. He's invited frequently to functional and integrative medicine conferences all around the world. We're going to see Tom in London at the NMI Summit later in the year, which is a great privilege for us. And this really comes through his work. I've not had a lot of meetings with Tom in person, but his work really speaks to something that resonates strongly with me, and it's a straightforward, science-based, practical approach to navigating the complexity of functional and integrative medicine through the use of lifestyle and non-pharmacological therapies. In addition to that work, he's an avid outdoorsman. We're actually speaking to Tom in Wisconsin at the moment, and we have a lovely view of the forest behind him where he lives. And, feels blessed to live there and be in that environment. So bit of an introduction there, Tom, but I just want to say welcome. It's a great privilege to be able to speak to you.
Well, thank you. I am glad to come to you here from, like I said, this is my backyard, but and looking forward to not only the conversation here, but getting over to London to the NMI conference this fall.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Like I said, it's our privilege. It's exciting to have you visit, but what we're going to do over the next 45 minutes, hour or so is dive into dietary supplements, which sounds, superficially like a bit of a dry topic, but these things are really fundamental to clinical practice, and there are nuanced and really interesting elements to understanding how to use these, how to navigate them, and so on. So that's kind of where I want to go. But before we get into that, I was just wondering if you could share a bit about how you got involved initially into the dietary supplement area and your experience, and then what led you to publish this roadmap or reference book.
Yeah, like you mentioned, I got my PhD in molecular biology or molecular immunology, more specifically, back in the early to mid 90s. And so I would say this field wasn't really on my radar at that point, but I was learning science. I was learning how to understand, information. And as I was going through that, a gentleman who owned a small dietary supplement company that was for physicians in the U.S. Interacted with me, over the years, and I didn't realize that he was kind of probably thinking, well, maybe I'll ask him if he'll come in to my business as being sort of a science person. And so that interaction happened in the mid 90s, 1996, and I decided to take a leap and come into this industry. And I remember him telling me something to the fact that, we want you to look at the science of nutrition and nutritional supplements and really tell us what is working, what is marketing, and what other things that do we need to do, or what other discoveries should we be looking at? And of course, in that time, I mean, in the US and probably over there, you probably use a lot of PubMed or that kind of thing. Well, PubMed didn't exist when I got hired, so it was I had to go and learn from books and go to actually go to libraries and get the journals themselves, which I was used to doing anyway. But then I started actually looking at, because the dietary supplement world is not just nutrients, it's herbs, it's fatty acids, it's other things. So I actually went to herbal conferences and I started going to meetings where people were discussing these things, and had my whole world kind of opened up to things that I had certainly not studied when I was doing my PhD in molecular immunology. And interestingly, at that time, especially the herbal world, perhaps more than others, was kind of very suspicious of PhDs and sort of taking away sort of the original herbalism and the kind of the mystery behind it, and kind of making it into like the science of pharmaceuticals or something. And so it was kind of interesting that I felt like a little bit of an outsider as a PhD, kind of trying to come in and learn from them. But then it didn't take long before, and maybe this is because of PubMed and the exposure of more research with people, they started looking at, what are the receptors? What are the mechanisms behind nutrients and herbal and, phytonutrients and fatty acids? And all of a sudden they started talking about receptors and DNA and epigenetics, and all of a sudden it became, now the world that I was in became kind of the center area. And so it turns out I had a leg up on a lot of the mechanisms and actions that people were investigating, because that's the world I lived in. So I understood about phosphorylation reactions and these kind of things, and of course immunology, and a lot of areas which now are, it seems like, the center of the whole functional integrative medicine world is really about the mechanisms. How do they work? And so even though I was in the science and regulatory area of this company, Ortho Molecular Products, as you mentioned, and I would go to meetings. I would go to, like, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the IFM and A4M meetings and a lot of smaller meetings in the US. And I would go, and as a science person, and I guess I'm a little bit wired to being skeptical of everything until I can vet it myself. And I would hear, individuals getting up on stage talking about things that I immediately knew were probably incorrect, but they had been just kind of recycling information that had been around a while. A lot of people maybe don't vet the information. They just heard it from another person, or whatever. And so I started thinking, somebody needs to write and correct some of these things, or at least subtly reassess. And I try to use the terms like reassessment. I don't always want to just, you know, uh, debunk everybody and try to expose people, because a lot of people are a lot of the ideas that we have, sometimes they make logical sense, but when you actually investigate, they don't turn out to be true. And there's other reasons why, and it's because a lot of things that we're learning, epigenetics and the microbiome. And when I first started in 1996 and 1997, I mean, nobody was talking about how the microbiome transformed, polyphenols or even vitamins and nutrients. I mean, so this is all really in the last couple decades. So then I started writing monographs, trying to, let's say, set the record straight or whatever, on certain things, or really try to go back into the literature and say, okay, what is the foundation for the understanding of this principle that we're using for, nutrient supplementation or stress management or cortisol or these kinds of things. And I started writing monographs, and then I actually wrote a book called The Original Prescription, was sort of my way of saying what is the original sort that was more lifestyle. So what is the lifestyle functional base that was, the original prescription that we were supposed to be following? And I did talk about the idea that while we have the potential to use, let's say, nature and lifestyle completely as a way to maintain our health, we usually get to a point where we use something called augmented lifestyle medicine. That is, once we understand the mechanism for, for instance, cruciferous vegetables, and we understand, the vitamins and sulforaphane and other, indoles that are in there, we can say to someone, okay, we want not just to eat a rounded diet, we want you to concentrate on the use of, broccoli and, these kinds of things that include these at a higher dose. So we're using diet, let's say, as a therapy there, where we're being more intentional about sort of like the same thing we would do with like exercise. Being on a treadmill is not a natural thing, but it activates the same natural things that walking does. So we use a treadmill because we don't maybe have a place to walk. Um, but going back to the broccoli, if we say, okay, now we understand that there are nutrients like sulforaphane, let's use as an example, we can now concentrate that. We can actually grow like broccoli sprouts and other ways of growing them quicker. We can concentrate them. And even though we still want you to eat broccoli and other cruciferous vegetables, we can now give you 200 milligrams of sulforaphane or whatever, and we can augment the signal that we know is supposed to be in broccoli, but we can get to those levels at a higher dose. We can do it quicker. We can do it more specifically because we don't necessarily know the exact dose in every cup of broccoli, but we do know how much is in this capsule. So the idea of using supplements that we'll talk about here is augmented lifestyle signals is the way that I've kind of come to a conclusion to help clinicians understand how to bridge the gap there. And then I started saying, well, let me collect these in these books. And so I started writing. Actually, the first one I did write was Supplementing Dietary Nutrients was my first edition. Um, and it was done, like anything, the first time you do something, I was trying to get through it, trying to understand like what is the scope of this project and things like that. And that was published in 2014. And I had a bigger team with me. And then of course, I ended up writing those 5 textbooks. And then I had a bigger team with me in 2020 when I expanded it to the second edition. So in this particular book, the second edition is almost a completely different book than the first edition because as you know, it's expanded quite a bit and includes a lot of information. So I kind of got into the writing phase, sort of thinking that a lot of people they get into nutrition and of course functional integrative medicine, and they go to conferences, and a lot of clinicians or a lot of the speakers want to talk about something very interesting, something very new, and which is great, but they often the audience doesn't always have the background information in transitioning from where they were in their training to understanding this. What I say a lot of times is when they go to these conferences, it's like getting Christmas tree ornaments, but when you get back home, you don't have a Christmas tree to hang them on
Yeah.
because they don't have the fundamental background to what is the basis for this idea of nutrition, functional medicine, integrative medicine, systems biology, all those words that are now used. And so I said, well, what if I write these textbooks that re-explain the foundational principles upon which these new ideas are based, and then include, the information. If you've seen the book, I have a lot of references in there, so people can go back and see, what is the study that this idea is based on. So that kind of just blossomed and into the five textbooks that have come out on these various topics: GI, cardiovascular, stress, etc.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it reminds me, actually, I was at a conference recently and I literally had a conversation in an elevator. Like, so, the expression an elevator
Right,
conversation
right.
pitch, but it was with a doctor who made exactly that point. He made the point that clinicians are often exposed to these, as you put it, such a great way to put it is like Christmas ornaments, like these exciting new products or tests or whatever. But what we really need is like this deep foundational information, and sometimes that's lacking, especially when people are recently into the field or they've done relatively short training, in functional medicine or so on, and that feels like a gap that you've really bridged with these foundational textbooks.
Yeah.
It's just something that people aren't speaking about in this kind of depth, but is very important in terms of underlying practice. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the advantages I had was just having, I didn't write these the first year I was, in the field, obviously,
Yeah.
and having almost by that point, 15 years of questions that clinicians have asked me about things that I've spoken about or other people. So I had sort of like I kind of had a little bit of a finger on the pulse of the need of physicians as they got into this field because I've been hearing all their questions and so it allowed me to kind of direct how I would write the books.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. So I think what we'll do is we'll sort of jump into some of the elements within supplementing dietary nutrients and bring that out to life a bit. One of the things I really noticed, like picking up that book, is the introductions or lifestyle medicine. So you have quite a lengthy discussion around concepts around lifestyle medicine, like biological resilience and optimization of nutrition. And, why is that preamble there? Was that important for you to have as a preface to talking about pills?
Yeah, I mean, the beginning of every one of the book actually has a similar chapter about what I call, the role of lifestyle medicine. That's where I talk about this idea of, lifestyle, then lifestyle as a therapy, which is kind of like, what I talked about is changing your diet, exercise, stress management. Then this augmented lifestyle therapy, where we're very specifically targeting those mechanisms. I frame what I talk about with chronic disease management with this idea that you mentioned, physiological resilience. So you need a reserve capacity, which I call metabolic reserve, which supports the resilience. So those two ideas, resilience and reserve, really are the fundamentals for really almost any chronic disease management that we can think of. And it goes all the way to longevity and that kind of medicine. What is your reserve capacity to deal with whatever comes your way on a regular basis? And so I talk about that in a number of different ways. Um, and most like stress and poor eating and all these kind of things really what they begin doing is they begin depleting your reserve capacity. So obviously when we're young, we have a lot of reserve capacity. If you're healthy and don't have, let's say, maybe genetic predisposition to something, that reserve capacity is so great that it seems like it's always going to be there. You can do whatever you want. You can seemingly eat whatever you want, stay up as late as you want, and but we all know as we age that we hit a point where we realize, no, we have been depleting this reserve. We just didn't. It was just always enough to deal with the resiliency of the decisions that we were making, as good or as bad as they were. But at some point, that reserve capacity is depleted, and now I can't do what I used to do, or I'm not able to, my metabolic rate has changed, or something is different. And so this idea of reserve capacity for nutrients, reserve capacity, your antioxidant reserve. What is your ability to, take on, reactive oxygen species or the sunlight or whatever it happens to be that affects, or your diet? What is your what is your immune capacity to deal with, a new virus or bacteria encounter? Or, what is your ability to use inflammation properly? We call it inflammaging, where you don't turn down inflammation. What is your reserve capacity for detoxification? What is your neuroplasticity, which is a reserve capacity? So all of these, when I started looking at all of these systems in the body, they all have a reserve capacity to deal with whatever comes their way, to deal with to create the resilience needed for your health. But eventually those reserves deplete, and then that's when you start seeing oh, this hurts, or this is not working the way it used to. I'm gaining weight because I think I'm eating the same or whatever. I'm not physically active as much or whatever. You know the story, that physicians deal with all the time. And this is usually hits people. I mean, obviously, in the day, it used to be 40 years old, 30 years old, or somewhere. But now we're seeing, because of diet and physical activity, we're seeing this at younger ages. So now we're seeing conditions in, teenagers that were typically thought to be adult onset. Type 2 diabetes being kind of classically one of those. And basically, we're we're affecting the reserve capacity. When insulin sensitivity is a capacity, it's a reserve capacity. How well can you dispose of glucose at every meal? Well, every meal is a physiological challenge that tests that resilience, but the reserve capacity is your pancreas and your insulin sensitivity and those kind of things. And when those begin to deplete earlier and earlier, it tells us that we're having some sort of cumulative effect. And that's why sort of we don't want to get into this, but that's why sort of the epigenetics, this accumulated thing that each generation is passing on to the next, seems to be creating this earlier and earlier. And so the idea of intervening with lifestyle, with things that have those big leverage. I mean, I say people eat about 50 tons of food in their lifetime. And that is a lot of signal capacity. That's a lot of chance to leverage all of these signals that are happening in the gut and in the liver and throughout the body. And so if we're not paying attention to those big levers, your physical activity every day, how do you handle stress and eventually the cortisol that comes from that, diet, relationships, all these kind of things that you have to do every single day, then trying to overwhelm that with something that's in pills, like I'm going to try to reverse your inability to deal with stress with something that's going to some adaptogen, for instance. It's asking a lot for these compounds, which are meant to be more subtle and long term rather than drugs, which we're more familiar with of being sort of overwhelming the system, sort of like a hammer coming in and just smashing up the place. Yes, they do work because they, bind to receptors in ways that natural ingredients don't, but they're really more what I call rescue interventions rather than really truly, altering physiology to make you healthy.
Yeah, that's an incredible way to frame it. And I think that's one of the striking things about the book is you're really contextualizing the use of these interventions in the background of like a functional lifestyle medicine systems biology based approach. So it's not like, here, take this pill for this. It's this is the real
Right.
foundational functional concepts, and this is how this fits into that. And I like that term, like augmenting, nutrition or augmenting diet with these types of interventions. So, I mean, that's a great way to set the scene. And, I know this conversation goes out to healthcare providers, but I wouldn't mind touching on some reoccurring themes that are used to like dismiss dietary supplements. Like if we can pick on a couple of those, like we get all the nutrients we need from food, healthy people don't need supplements. Supplements are just like expensive urine or a waste of money. And the big one, which I know be good at commenting on, is like studies just show they don't work as well. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if we can just pick apart a couple of these quickly and from your perspective, it'd be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, a couple of those, maybe we can start the last one, the studies don't work. I mean, um, this is where it depends on which study gets published, or I should say, which study gets publicized. And I think I've been doing this since the mid 90s, and it is interesting that the more negative the study, it seems like the more press that it gets. So
Yeah.
you'll find a study that will come out and it seems obviously everybody likes to be controversial or something. And so if you thought magnesium worked for this, or if you thought vitamin D worked for this, here's a study that shows not only didn't it work for that particular outcome, but then it's useless for anything is kind of usually the end. It's sort of like saying, if water doesn't cure cancer, then you should stop drinking water. I mean, that's almost as ridiculous as some of these
Yeah.
ideas out there. So I've spent a lot of time with that, and I would say that um, nutrients that are studied like drugs. So, a lot of times, and I could argue that this is sort of the fault of even sometimes within the nutrient world, we design our trials oftentimes like a drug trial. So we have, placebo controlled, and we're trying to do like we're trying to approve it as a drug,
Yeah.
and we're using it for outcomes that, you know, folic acid to try to reverse, cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events in people that have already had a heart attack. Okay, so if you looked at any of these studies, for instance, and there's quite a few of them that look at all kinds of nutrients in that environment, Most of these people are probably 80 to 90% of them are on a statin drug. Many of them are on a beta blocker, calcium channel blocker, diuretics because they have hypertension or something else. And then you add, let's say, 800 micrograms of folic acid and nothing changes. And therefore, you say folic acid is of no value. And then that's kind of the conclusion, or whatever the ingredient happens to be, or vitamin C, or whatever. And I just look at these studies and I wonder, is there any biological plausibility that folate in that context would have made a difference?
Mm,
And usually the answer is no. And ironically, they don't even choose a group of people who are low in folate.
mhm.
They would give it across the board. Well,
Yep.
nobody gives statin drugs to people who are already on statins, and, to test that. So in
Yep.
one way, when we talk about the research, there are literally thousands of papers that we draw off of, and to show that these nutrients have biological plausibility or of value. Most of them are going to be valuable in individuals that are depleted in that particular nutrient. It's impossible to do a study where you completely remove these nutrients because we know they're essential and people get, uh, you know, diseases like scurvy, whatever, beriberi, when you deplete these. So we know that there are depletion disorders, and so we don't have we don't have people saying that these do nothing, um, but they may not function in the same way, especially in the environment where we have sort of a polypharmacy. And so we can go on and on about all kinds of studies. One that I'm reminded of that I always bring out is it depends on how you do a study based on primary and secondary outcomes and all kinds of things. There was a large study done in the United States by the NIH called the GATE trial, which looked at glucosamine and chondroitin sulfate for osteoarthritis. This was published years ago, and and when it first came out, when the abstract came out, and it was in I think it was in a meeting. It was wildly popular. It was like this worked great. It had wildly statistical. And they used against Celebrex back then. They used that as one of the arms. And then when the paper came out, like 2 months later, it was viewed as a negative study because because of the primary outcome was kind of washed away, and Celebrex and the chondroitin glucosamine mixture had similar effects. But then when you dug down into the trial, when you pooled everybody together in the trial, that was true. But if you looked at only the people with moderate to severe arthritis, the glucosamine chondroitin outperformed statistically in every aspect better than Celebrex. But because that was not a primary outcome, meaning the subpopulations, it was not permitted to be used in the abstract or in the conclusion. So these are the kinds of things that when you start digging in, you realize that there's much more there, and we can go through hundreds and hundreds of vitamin D studies and vitamin C studies. So
Yeah.
the funny one you mentioned is you have just expensive urine. This idea that the idea is really you don't need these things; they're just going out.
Yeah.
And obviously, when you're talking about a multivitamin, that's true. There may be, some of the, of course, the riboflavin is what you see when you see the yellow, the bright yellow. But yes, that's true. Some of the water soluble vitamins where you don't need more, you of course remove them from the body. And of course, the ones that you don't realize you need are absorbing, and those are the benefits. So when you're taking a multivitamin, as you know, there's like 20, 30, 40 ingredients in there. And the question is, which one of these is actually, which of these 40 are you needing? So you may only need 10 of those, but it's very difficult from a testing standpoint to know which of those 10 are depleted or less than optimal. And so you take a multivitamin. And so, if COVID wasn't that long ago, or Corona, as some people call it. And you look into the literature, and we found out people that were replete, meaning they had enough of vitamin D and many of the nutrients, had a lower risk of some of the complications with COVID. And so I have a slide that I put out. It says, where I actually use the, your urine, vitamins just make your expensive urine. And my response to that is COVID was a bad time to find out that you had cheap urine.
That's good.
Because, the idea is Yeah, if you the people that were deciding that they were not supplementing, and most of these people, frankly, were probably not eating well either, because we know that there's a correlation with people who are concerned about their health. Not only do they eat well, but they also realize they need supplements, and they often supplement. So those go hand
Yeah.
in hand anyway. But finding out in a crisis that you are actually depleted in a lot of these micronutrients that, for instance, magnesium, which almost everybody is low in, or vitamin D, especially if you're not getting sunlight. So this is I use it humorously, but it's really a reflection of the fact that we don't get enough of these nutrients, even in some of the best diets, because there are a wide range of nutrients.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really well put. And I think a lot of really good food for thought in that. I think moving on from like these sort of myths, so to speak, around supplements and getting into a bit more sort of nitty-gritty around how to navigate and use these in clinical practice, I wouldn't mind touching on firstly some like common marketing claims, which I think inherently are quite difficult even for healthcare providers to navigate, often because they're sort of dressed as science as well. So they can be challenging to pick apart. So we'll maybe dig into a few of those and then go into some more generalizable practical considerations around the clinical use of supplements as well. So in terms of marketing, some themes that come up a bit, not super frequently, luckily, I guess, but do sort of perennially come back around, is firstly the difference between synthetic and natural. So my question to you is like, what is the difference and does it matter? And then another question is around like whole food, and there's a few other terms that are used related to this, like food state, food grown, so on. So I'm wondering if we can just briefly pick apart some of those. Firstly, the synthetic versus natural thing. So I think that does confuse people, especially end
Yeah,
consumers.
yeah. I mean, this is a complicated issue because I mean, let's say each of the nutrients has sometimes let's say a synthetic version or others versions that are out there. So in the book that you mentioned, Supplementing Dietary Nutrients, each of the monographs actually discusses like individual differences between the synthetic forms, if there are those, and the natural forms. And I would say it really depends on whether, and I like to use the term, bioequivalent, and biosimilars. So you have some things that are bioidentical, some things that are bioequivalent, and then biosimilar. So bioidentical means the synthetic form is identical. I mean, chemically you can't tell the difference between the two. And I would suggest, at least the data that we would have, is the body doesn't seem to know the difference between the two, treats them identical. And I should mention that almost all of the research that we have done, and starting in like the early 1900s, with once we isolated these compounds, they were typically isolated and or synthesized, and that's how we discovered what they did in cell culture and in animals. So only recently have we been asking some of these more subtle questions, and oftentimes we don't have the tools to distinguish them. So for instance, when I tell people the ascorbic acid that's synthesized, typically from a corn-based sorbose that's then converted to ascorbic acid, is indistinguishable, biologically, from, let's say, the ascorbic acid or the vitamin C that you would have in, let's say, orange juice or something like that. Now, maybe the orange juice has some flavonoids or something else that affects the benefit of that vitamin C, but it really doesn't. The vitamin C component is identical. And so if we look at thiamine and riboflavin, for instance, USP riboflavin is a synthetic ingredient put in supplements, but we know there's no scientific evidence, and there's been a lot of looking at whether riboflavin found in plants is any different. Now, I talk about also this idea of riboflavin phosphate, or the phosphorylated form, versus the non-phosphorylated form. And interestingly, here in the US, a lot of people talk about the activated forms of these vitamins, and I'll just say riboflavin, for instance. The body actually has to dephosphorylate riboflavin phosphate in order to absorb it. So you might say, well, it is a more natural form. It's the form often found in the plant, but actually it has to be dephosphorylated in order to be absorbed. So these are the kind of things that I kind of walk into. Vitamin D, vitamin D3, for instance. Vitamin D3 is naturally made when sunlight hits your skin. Very little vitamin D3 is found in any foods. Vitamin D2 is found in, fungi, mushrooms, things like that. But vitamin D3, unless you're in here in the US, we fortify milk with vitamin D3. But that's sort of a food, but it's really a fortified food. But where do we get vitamin D3 in the capsules? Most people don't realize where it comes from, so maybe this will be a scandal. But it comes from lanolin. They take sheep they take the same thing that's found in your skin is actually found in the lanolin of sheep. And so when you take that and you expose it to UV light, those same precursors, those vitamin D3 precursors, when they're hit with vitamin D, convert to the same vitamin D3 we find in our body after sunlight hits our skin, and then we concentrate it and then put it in capsules. So the question is that natural or is that synthetic? Or if we take, let's say, calcium carbonate from limestone and we dissolve it and add it with, let's say, citric acid and we make calcium citrate, well, is that a natural? I mean, the calcium is natural, it comes from limestone, but now you've made it into a compound called calcium citrate. And so is that natural or synthetic? So I actually talk about a lot of these things. And there are times when there's a difference. I think vitamin E is probably the biggest one that we know of. And that's because vitamin E made synthetically has 8 isomers, only 2 of which are really biologically useful. And so the question is the synthetic, these other isomers, are they actually harmful? Do they block the benefit of the vitamin E that you would take that's synthetic, which is usually called DL tocopherol because of the way that the light shines. So alpha tocopherol or D alpha tocopherol is the natural form, and typically that's taken from, well, let's say it's from oils that maybe we don't like. Soybean oil is actually a very common precursor to vitamin E, natural vitamin E. So maybe people don't like it for that reason, but it's been purified to the point where there's no other soy component in there. So anyway, this is why these questions need to be taken on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
But because of these differences, marketing companies will then use the confusion to say, well, our version is always better and this other version is always bad. Probably the case of methylcobalamin versus cyanocobalamin. Okay. While I do prefer the using methylcobalamin, I don't prefer it because the cyanocobalamin is going to poison you with cyanide, okay, which has never been shown. And the data to suggest that methylcobalamin is dramatically more effective at doing what it's supposed to do than cyanocobalamin is really lacking. And it's because of the only enzyme that uses methylcobalamin and cyanocobalamin doesn't really care which one it uses.
Yeah.
And so even though I may prefer the methyl form, I would be cautionary to try to say that there's all kinds of demonstrable clinical differences when there aren't. So every one of these needs to be taken on a case by case basis. But as you know, marketers like that subtle confusion and will convince a clinician by the just a thread of evidence to move over to their product. So I often push back against those kinds of claims.
Yeah, no, it's a great way to put it. And I think it speaks to one of the comments you made opening this conversation is it was around like just vetting things basically and, making sure you're not taking things as hearsay and repeating and, just taking things at face value. So it's really asking those harder questions basically to sort of separate fact from fiction, so to speak, or reframe things as you put it. That's a great
Right.
way to it's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
I get
And
late. Yeah.
some of it is partly dose dependent,
Yeah.
meaning that some of these, let's say, concentrated ingredients, because we don't typically eat in the diet hundreds of milligrams of B vitamins. But there are therapeutic uses for some of those B vitamins at those higher doses. And where you start getting into nuances is where some of these B vitamins will absorb, let's say, passively rather than through their normal, receptor mechanisms. And at higher doses, some of the, let's call them synthetic or non-phosphorylated forms, like in the case of vitamin B6, pyridoxine 5-phosphate, may be safer in some individuals when you get above 25 or 50 milligrams. And so these are some nuances that change the dynamic, because now you're using uh, higher doses than are typical of diet, and then you get absorption and changes that may have some negative consequences because of the dose that you're using. And so that's where things need to be caveated just a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's a really great caveat and a good point. Let's dive into some sort of broad generalizations around the clinical use of supplements. I thought some good themes to get into would be like, firstly, like assessing quality. I feel like every one of these is going to open up an hour per
Yeah,
per point,
yeah,
but we'll do what we can. But what is a good quality supplement? Because every brand says they're the best quality. Some nuances around bioavailability and where or why that might matter, and then just practical stuff like how do you assess need, dose, things like meal timing and frequency, and then safety. So, do you want to
yeah.
start on the quality piece?
Yeah, I mean, quality it's also a big nuanced discussion, and can be used for marketing different things. So there's two sort of separate levels of quality, meaning you can assess ingredients to make sure they're safe, they are what they say they are, they're at the right dose, or that I should say they're at the dose that is claimed on the label. So when I say, if I look at my product and I say, okay, it says there's supposed to be 10 milligrams of vitamin C, or maybe 100 milligrams of vitamin C, and I test my product and it has 100 milligrams of vitamin C at the time of expiration, therefore that's high quality. That's one way to assess it. And so with that assessment, you could say, well, if I go, and I don't know if you have this thing, is Wonder Bread a thing in the UK? Wonder Bread?
No, but I know what you mean. It's like
Okay,
white,
so
fluffy.
this white bread,
Yeah.
this white bread that we used to say in the US, I wonder why it's called bread. But anyway, if you look at it and you say, okay, what's on the label and what's the ingredients? Are they there? Is it quality? Does it meet the quality standards? And you'd probably say yes, it meets the quality standards of everything that ingredients are safe. They're in there at the right amount. And then you say, okay, well, now I go to a bakery that has made their bread, and most people don't go into a bread store and buy a beautiful loaf of bread and say, can you show me all the SOPs you use to bake this? But you taste it and you say the quality of the bread, the is miles of difference than the Wonder Bread. So those are two different aspects of quality, meaning does it pertain to the ingredient that's supposed to be in there? Did you follow the right procedures to get there? Whatever. And obviously in the US, I would say the vast majority of companies are following the first component, meaning they are following the procedures. And although I will say that we routinely get people testing ingredients found on the shelf, and they're not finding certain ingredients in there at the right dose. So we do know that either one, and I want to be careful, because some of the people that are publishing that data are not adequately scientifically uh, doing the correct tests,
Yeah.
always to determine that. So some of that data needs to be taken with a grain of salt, but we do know that people either are intentionally cutting corners, or somehow maybe their procedures are not causing those ingredients to stay stable enough to be tested throughout the shelf life of the product. So
Yeah.
those are concerns, but I would say that if you are buying from let's say a relatively known manufacturer that has any sort of reputation in their field, of whether it's the retail or the physician channel brand, those issues are less likely to come up.
Yeah.
The issue, however, is, are the products really designed to do what they are claiming to do? Are they really designed properly to replete the nutrient that they're trying to replete? Are the doses, because many of these doses are of inadequate amounts. A lot of times they'll try to throw what we in the US call everything but the kitchen sink in there. And so you have, 1 milligram of vitamin C. Well, even if the 1 milligram could be proven to be in there, 1 milligram of vitamin C is not a good use of the capsule, that 1 milligram. It's doing really nothing for you. And so I think that part of the quality is the product designed in a way to be useful for whatever the outcome is. And of course, most of my career has been not just developing supplements just to replete nutrients, but to try to target specific outcomes in people that have a condition of one sort or the other. And so, finding what the adequate um, dose is for that particular ingredient. Is it synergistic with other ingredients? Does it make sense to combine, these three or four things together at the dose that is there? And those are the more nuanced ways of understanding quality in ensuring that the product really is designed for what you're using it for. And this is why, I've spent my career in the physician channel because a lot of times people are taking products and they, without some sort of help, they're using social media or, other things to help guide, what they're taking. And they may have a condition which isn't even diagnosed properly, thinking it's one thing, and, using what they think is an over-the-counter product. And they may be maybe not harming themselves, but certainly not helping themselves, but in some cases, maybe harming themselves. So I think those are two levels of quality. So I would say always ask questions, always I would say use reputable suppliers that are somewhat well known because they are going to be not only following the rules of the country of the manufacturer that they're using, but also hopefully they will have, kind of those things in place. And I think we've now, at least in the US, we've had these regulations in place for, over 20 years. But if you're buying something that's only found on the internet, you've never heard of these people before, uh, or you're using them for typically the area where we see the most corner cutting would be weight loss products, sports related products, sexual enhancement type products. These are the kinds of products that are oftentimes counterfeited the most or using ingredients that are suspect. And so, buyer beware, I think, but I think our industry is of high quality, I think, overall.
Yeah, no, it's really, really well put, and it's a great way to frame the quality piece. I think what I'm hearing you say is that the two levels are like verification of what's in there, what it really says on the label is actually in the product, and then I guess the expertness of the formulation itself, and
Right,
ensuring that it's really designed to do what it says it's supposed to do, which
right.
are not easy things for a clinician to navigate, but that's a great, overview of
Right.
some really important areas for people to be thinking about. One that comes up a lot here in the UK is bioavailability, and I have a suspicion it's because we're not allowed to make a lot of health claims. So people, companies are making bioavailability claims, and there are whole
Right.
brands based on it. So it'd be interesting to get your perspective around the broader issue of bioavailability. I suspect again, it's probably case by case, but do you
Yeah.
have some overarching comments around that?
Of course. I actually wrote a white paper on the whole idea of bioavailability, which it's actually free on my website, pointinstitute.org, so people can go and get that. And I think that white paper is modified and in the book itself. So I do have a lot to talk about this because it's a complicated issue. Again, on a case by case basis, bioavailability it differs, but the bioavailability doesn't always, and I would say absorption, because there's different words like with anything, there's different uses. So, for instance, if we take classic things like if we go into herbal world like curcumin, we have a lot of people advertising certain curcumin, natural curcumin doesn't absorb very well. That's from turmeric. But if you modify it via all these different ways, and there's like 20 different ways to modify curcumin to make it more absorbable. But when I think of the word bioavailable, I'm thinking, do I have an active ingredient at the site in the cell that's doing its work? And that's really another level of bioavailability than just does it get in from the gut into the body. And I spend a lot of ink talking about the fact that making curcumin more absorbable has not made it more bioactive. And part of the reason is in the case of curcumin, and this is likely true of a lot of phytochemicals, polyphenols, is that these are highly bioactive compounds. We know that from cell culture data. And the body does not like to have highly bioactive compounds floating around. And so almost all of this absorption, like 90, I would say 99% of the increased absorption of curcumin is immediately when it gets to the liver is detoxified. It's a sulfate or a glucuronide is added to it and it's detoxified. And that's one of the reasons why we don't see dramatic clinical differences when we use these highly, quote, highly bioavailable or highly absorbable forms. And it's just because biologically the body doesn't want, 100 times more curcumin floating around. It has all kinds of activities that the body says is just too volatile. And so that's a normal path. That's why I believe that a lot of these are functioning at the level of the gut microbiome, where actually the lack of absorption actually keeps them available to the gut. But if we start looking at, let's say, 5-methylfolate versus folic acid, the issue there isn't bioavailability. Actually, folic acid absorbs, when we talk about passive absorption, it passively absorbs at these high doses. But in those cases, certain individuals that can't convert folic acid into its dihydrofolate and its methyl form may be potentially harmed by high doses of folic acid in those instances. So there's the subtle difference. Some of it is bioavailability, and some of it is based on other factors, like in this case, genetic susceptibility for the conversion to its final form. For instance, another one that's often used is, CoQ10, ubiquinol versus ubiquinone. Ubiquinone is CoQ10, ubiquinol is the alcohol form of that. And so there's a lot of people that are saying, well, you need to use one form versus the other because we have this one paper that says it absorbs better. Well, I've investigated, and you can find that, first of all, there's not really a high quality studies that investigate these differences in humans, which is really where a lot of this fails anyway. But as it turns out, a lot of these things are very subtle and maybe not even clinically relevant. I also spent a lot of time in the fish oil world where we talk about bioavailability of, EPA and DHA based on their triglyceride form and, ethyl ester form, which is more the synthetic form. And there are subtle differences and probably maybe even clinical differences in using, let's say, the triglyceride form, because that is the more natural form, which the body then breaks down the triglyceride into monoglycerides. And so, there are some subtle differences when it comes to like fish oil, things like that. So again, these are things that need to be taken on a case by case basis. And typically, if there's a major difference, I have published on that because this is an area that I've spent a lot of time on. And I would say that probably about, and I'm just throwing a number here, 75% of these differences that are marketed as differences probably are not clinically relevant. And probably the other 25% have some clinical relevance. And you really should be asking the question, what is the data? Not just what is the data on the difference between bioavailability, but can you show me the data that shows that that's clinically relevant? And that's the issue, because you can always show a difference in bioavailability depending on what you're measuring, but that, like for instance, in the case of curcumin, that has not been shown to be biologically relevant or clinically relevant, and that's the question that people should be asking in the end.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it, and it's something that is inherently lacking in the literature is you see these products sort of marketed on pharmacokinetic studies,
Right.
that were done 20 years ago, and they've been leveraging that forever. But I've often wondered the same thing, is like, does that translate to a better clinical outcome? And it's very rare, if not completely absent in the literature, to see head-to-head comparisons between a poor bioavailable comparator versus the highly bioavailable product. Just those studies aren't done.
And some of these other nutrients, so like one I'll give an example that probably makes a big difference, is it's not really a food, it's chondroitin sulfate. And chondroitin sulfate is taken from cartilage. And although there are some chondroitin sulfates now being derived from fermentation from bacteria so that we don't have to take it from animals. But the way that you produce the chondroitin sulfate creates a different molecular weight. And we do know that there's huge molecular weight structures that have zero absorption. They don't absorb at all. And if you hydrolyze it down to a certain molecular weight, you can get it to absorb. And so those are some places where there could be some significant clinical differences. But that's because you're dealing with a nutrient that's really not a nutrient. It's sort of like a modified nutrient that isn't really the body's not normally taking in chondroitin sulfate from cartilage. So, so that there's some differences there when it comes to nutrients, which are more, I would call them therapeutic ingredients than like classic nutrients.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think unfortunately, we're gonna have to start to draw to a close, but around this broad theme of like clinical use, are there any big topics that you find come up regularly with healthcare providers that we haven't touched on you want to dig into a
Yeah,
bit?
I mean, you were talking about dose. I think, you know, understanding the acute use of these ingredients at high doses, for instance, a lot of studies that are trying to use vitamins as drugs, they often will use these high doses, attempting to, get some dramatic effect on some outcome so they can, if they want to do a study, they want to get it done in 12 weeks. Like we need to see a study, we need to see a result quickly because we don't want to pay for these long studies. And a lot of clinicians will be, there are some nutrients that can be used that way. But most of these nutrients, and considering also phytonutrients, these are meant to be taken over the long term, and they're usually modulating systems, again, maintaining resilience and reserve, not necessarily trying to completely reverse the process of the body like a drug would. So I think the clinicians need to consider nutrients as like they do with food. You don't expect food to have this immediate change overnight unless it's like a toxic food and you're removing it or something. So most of these pairing the right patient with the right product at the right dose and waiting for, the time it takes for these things to change. You're trying to build a reserve capacity that's been depleted. Um, Many of the studies, for instance, like for instance, you take fish oil. You can give somebody fish oil, um, and you're trying to get let's say, their tissue saturated with omega-3s. But once you get to a saturation level, you don't really go above that because the body is already saturated. And that's true of vitamin D. That's true of a lot of the fat soluble vitamins. Whereas the water soluble vitamins, they need to be taken in small doses every day or quite frequently. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about eating seasonally and eating kind of these sort of things. Depending on there are different nutrients available at different times, but then there are some nutrients that are available all the time at very low doses. So if you look at the what we call the daily recommended values or whatever of some of these, they're very low, like thiamine in 1 or 2 milligrams. But that's because you need a little bit every day. It's a daily intake. And so you can't replete with 50 milligrams one day and then not get any for 2 weeks. So it's really understanding how nutrients work, and understanding that your patient, if you have a test that shows they're depleted in vitamin D and they're very likely, let's say, depleted in magnesium or low in magnesium, these kinds of things can change very quickly when you bring them from a depleted level to a normal level. But to get from normal to optimized, let's say optimized, that's a more subtle process and it takes some time. And so again, using nutrients, having the proper expectations for how nutrients work in the clinical setting and not imagining that they're like drugs. And I think that will really help not only the clinician as they're making decisions, but the expectation of the patient. And then understanding, like I said, that these are always augmented. You should overlay these with proper diet, that kind of that broad thing that you're trying to do for them, because those are the big levers.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a beautiful way to wrap up, the broadness of this conversation, bringing it back to where we started. And, that concept, I think, is really powerful of reframing how we think about these interventions. I think one of the traps that we've fallen into culturally in medicine is we have this idea that a potent pill is going to cure or, significantly manage a problem. But the frame that you're speaking to is more about incorporating these with lifestyle and dietary medicine as subtle modifiers over long periods of time of physiological reserve, which is a completely different frame of reference, really, or way of looking at things. It's really well put.
Yeah, I think that I think clinicians just need to really, I mean, obviously they need to be students of the ingredients and the products they're using, and really be able to match them appropriately with the patient and the expectations of the patient.
Yeah, yeah. No, well said. And I really appreciate your time today, Tom. It's been a privilege to be able to talk through this topic with you. I feel like we've got to get you back for another conversation. There's so much more we could have dove into, but I think for clinicians, just be on behalf of the listeners, thank you for taking us on a bit of a tour into a pretty complex area. And I think there's some very good, salient points that will help people navigate dietary supplements better through the lens of your experience. And just again, for listeners, if you didn't catch that up front, go to the Point Institute and the reference textbook we've been speaking to is Supplementing Dietary Nutrients, the second edition, Point Institute 2020. So thank you again, and we'll see you in London for the NMI Summit.
Okay, great conversation. I love to come back and talk again sometime soon.
Cheers.